Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing the Jonathan Evison novel West of Here, talk briefly about the author, I'll go into a spoiler-free overview of the plot, talk about what I liked about the book, what I didn't like about the book, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. This is the first Jonathan Evison novel that I've read. Doing some research on his background, he's from the Pacific Northwest. He is fairly well reviewed. He's won some prizes, and he's made it on some best of the end of the year lists. I think he was on one of the best of the end of the decade lists. Not for this book, but for other books. This is the second book of his that he's written. He's gone on to write a few more. He's had a few of his things. Well, one of his things in particular has been adapted into a movie, though I've never seen it. And the other thing I think of note for him was, I think the first novel he published back in 2008 wasn't published till he was 40, which is a little late, and that's kind of atypical. But this book, West of Here, it's a little bit hard to describe as far as the plot goes because it is mostly character-driven. But what the book follows is about a year in the history of a town called Port Bonita, which is a fictional town in Washington State. The year 1890, about a year from 1890 to 1891. It's like September of 1890 to September of 1891, something like that. And then the same thing in the year 2006. And the book follows about half a dozen characters in each of the timelines. And the way the book is structured is kind of intercut back and forth. So it's not necessarily told in sections of 1890 to 2007. The book is broken down as short chapters. So you may have a chapter in September 1890, and the next chapter may be September 2006. And it kind of doesn't necessarily go one for one back and forth, but it kind of follows along in that same format. Just to give a couple brief examples of some of the characters. One of the characters in the 1890 chapter is a man named Mather, who is leading an expedition to map the area around Port Bonita, which is at that point a fledgling town. And he's gone past the mountains, past kind of where civilization ends, to find out what's kind of beyond the last of the mountain ranges. And he's leading a mapping expedition to do that. You also have, during that time, the gentleman whose name is Thornborough, I believe, who is basically leading the building of a dam, a hydroelectric dam that's going to power the town. And in the 2006 chapter, some of the characters who are the descendants of those characters are still around. And that chapter concerns those characters who are around for what eventually happens is the dam eventually comes down and is removed, which is not really a spoiler because it happens at the very beginning of the book. And the chapters in 2006 are mostly surrounding the townspeople who are still in town at that point. Even though it's kind of a small dying town, industry is kind of left, and it's kind of about them kind of finding their paths and things like that. Again, it's not really so much of a plot-heavy novel as it is thematically heavy and really following these characters as they kind of go about their lives. One of the things that I did like is, even though it is a fictional town, there are several maps in the book of the area. And so I think through that and through the writing, you do get a sense of place that's very strong. I think that as far as tone and stuff, the book does kind of shift in tone as it goes throughout. I would describe it kind of similarly to a Coen Brothers movie. I've seen a lot of people describe this book as really funny. I think it's much more serious than funny personally. There are some moments of slapstick that you do get in kind of like something like Burn After Reading or something, or any Coen Brothers movie. There's usually a bit of slapstick, but I would say from the serious to the slapstick percentage, I'd say it's 80-90% serious to like 10 to 20% slapstick. At least I felt that way. I think that there were some characters who have really strong arcs, and I think there were some characters that I did feel very sympathetic for, who are well drawn and well fleshed out. I think the relationships that he draws, I feel, as far as romantic relationships in the book, There are a few of them, and I had kind of mixed feelings about them. But the one that I think he handled the best, I think it did feel like a natural progression, a natural evolution of some characters, which I enjoyed. He also has some of the characters are Native Americans, First People, and I think he does a good job, especially in the 1890 chapters, of making them felt like a real group, in the sense that they're not a monolithic group. There's a sect is maybe not the correct word, but a sect of them go off to found what they call the colony, which is a group of Native Americans who become followers of, I believe they're Quakers. They're one part of them are doing that, and there's another part who are more integrated in the town, and are still not following kind of the teachings of that faith. So I did enjoy that. I did feel that was handled realistically. Some of the things I didn't like as much, I had a hard time with the book, in the sense that there seemed to be a lot of characters. It is not necessarily the longest book I've ever read or anything, but I think that from a plot standpoint, there were a lot of characters who weren't necessarily needed to drive the plot. They were there more from a thematic standpoint. And I thought that there were quite a few of them who were thin, who didn't feel fleshed out, and their stories weren't particularly interesting. There's also, from my viewpoint, some characters whose stories kind of end abruptly is maybe not the right word, but they didn't end in a very satisfying manner. Kind of as I alluded to earlier, there's one or two relationships that didn't feel realistic, and I couldn't quite place why those two characters were together in one instance. There were a couple of characters who were on the border of being zany for the sake of being zany, who had certain characteristics or tics that felt kind of over the top. There's one character who, to me, is the most sympathetic character in the book, whose name is Krieg, which is short for Krigstead, I believe. And he has some traits and characteristics about him that are basically borderline stereotype, but I think he is drawn sympathetically enough and realistically enough that you basically accept that of his character. And there are other characters who you're not quite there, so they do in some ways, they don't necessarily feel like stereotypes, but they feel like zany for the sake of being zany and not necessarily real three-dimensional characters. I think that was overall my issues with the book. From a thematic standpoint, I think he does a good job of driving home the point of the book, which to me ultimately is about you have a sense of place, and what does that mean? What do you do when you're in a place where there just aren't any options necessarily for you to grow and to change, and the only way that you can do that is if you make changes to yourself. And how do you go about making changes to yourself, and at what point do you accept responsibility, and what point do you have to leave either the ways that you've known before or the area where you are. So the whole book to me is mostly about change and how do you accept change and things like that. And there's, I think, very intentional echoings of characters and situations in the 1890 chapters and in the 2006 chapters. In one character, there are two characters that's made like manifest. I think there are some like supernatural overtones of this book that may put some people off. Yeah, that's overall it. I think in a lot of ways the book is would have been better with, I think, fewer characters, and there had been more of a focus on plot. I definitely felt like in the beginning, especially when you're laying out the history, which is important for you to get a sense of place in 1890, but there's not necessarily a connecting event or anything that is a mystery or anything that like keeps pulling you through. There is an event that kind of kicks off the beginning of the book, and I could see some people being really interested in hearing the full story of what happens, but I could also equally see people not being super interested. Compared this to something like Rebecca Frumpkin's The Come Down, which I was kind of lukewarm on. One of the things I think that book does a good job of, and like this book, it has a lot of different characters in it. I think there's a central mystery to that book that kind of pulls you through the entire novel. And I think if there had been something like this in this book, I think it would have been, if done well, a really effective tool to keep the interest going throughout the whole thing. I was able to get through it, and I think that the chapters are relatively short, but I definitely felt a sense of it not being as strong as it could have been. Who I would recommend is book 2. I would say that if you have a hard time with scenes of domestic violence, I believe there are some scenes of sexual violence, and there's some scenes between a prostitute and her John and her, for lack of a better word, her pimp. That are kind of hard to read. They're not overly graphic, but they are there. And so if you have a hard time with those things, I would avoid it. I would recommend it to people who are writing as writers, who are writing any kind of ensemble piece. And I would also recommend it to anyone who's trying to get a better sense of place. Because I think like the strongest point of this book is really the ability for the author to make a place that is fictional feel realistic. I think he gets down the small town feeling of a small town modern American city really well, as far as the lack of economic options and kind of everybody having festivals or events where everybody is, or having kind of a local watering hole and making that feel real. I think kind of the other things that I mentioned, I think he doesn't do as effectively. I think there are some character motivations that are missing. The other part of it, I think that was the other highlight from like a story standpoint, is the Mather expedition feels like almost a Jack London Call of the Wild, as he's going through the mountains with his team and leading them, and them going through their trial and tribulations. And those were the kind of the most action-packed parts of the book. And I think that those, even though they feel in some ways like a different book, I still enjoyed those parts, and I found myself looking forward to them as the book went on. So even though they didn't necessarily fit, I did feel like that was an integral part to the book, and that was kind of my favorite, probably of the chapters, my favorite, because I felt like the arc of it was fairly complete. And there's another one or two characters in the modern day who have fairly complete arcs, but there's a lot of in movies, in modern movies, one of the criticisms you see is if you have like a buddy comedy with Owen Wilson and Vince Vaughn, and they have kind of like side characters who have problems. So there's a problem of a guy who doesn't have any confidence, and so you show the first scene of him not having confidence. The first scene of him establishing the problem, the second scene of him trying to overcome the problem and failing, and the third scene is Owen Wilson or Vince Vaughn talking them up and them actually succeeding in overcoming the problem in like 3 scenes. There's some characters in this book who felt that way. It's just kind of, you're there very, very briefly, and you've had a couple chapters, but your overall impact of the story didn't feel particularly powerful or useful. And if we had excised you from the book, I don't know if we necessarily would have lost very much. They add to some of the echoing or twinning that I mentioned before, and some things thematically, but in a book this size, I don't know if we couldn't have cut some of those characters. So that's West of Here. There are some parts that I definitely enjoyed, and I would recommend it to the people I mentioned before. And next time I'm going to be reading Ann Patchett's Bel Canto. As always, if you have read the book and have feelings or comments about it, please leave them in the comment section below. And also, if you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye.